Okay, so recording started. Welcome to everybody. This is the new webinar of the second season of the ELS, and I'm happy to be here today with Michael Nickerson. Michael is research chair for the Ministry of Agriculture and professor at the University of Saskatchewan. And main focus of his research is about protein for industry and plant protein ingredients. And he has a long career and a lot, more than 200 papers published on this. And today, well, I let Professor Nickerson introduce the topic for today.
Thanks, Nelson. I'm just going to share my slides.
Yes.
Okay. Does that look okay?
Yes.
Looks good.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, well, thank you everyone for inviting me. I'm really excited to take part, and I've been working quite a bit with Tom over the years. So attending one of his conferences is a big step, and I look forward, hopefully, to maybe go to Australia, like you mentioned. So, you know, today I'm sort of on the value-added side of plant proteins. So, and I'll talk about my research program, but my main focus is taking the proteins out of the seed and finding value-added uses primarily in the food industry as new ingredients and moving towards plant-based foods. So one of the things that when we talk about the protein sector is, you know, what are the major drivers? And you see a lot in the news about the plant-based food market, how that's expanding. We are actually seeing a little drop in that trend right now, but the plant-based food market is really driving a lot of the protein innovations in this space. By 2027, it's thought that the plant-based food market is about 74 billion, and quite a good growth rate as well. Now, when we talk about plant-based foods, there's not a real straightforward regulatory definition of plant-based foods, but they include a wide range of products, vegetables, fruits, nuts. But one of the big market segments that we start seeing is the non-dairy products, whether it's milk primarily, or, you know, you're starting to see non-dairy yogurts or cheeses. But the other big market segments is the meat analogs. So whether it's a binder or the artificial meat products are big market segments for protein innovations in the space. Now, what I always want to highlight to viewers is that, you know, the plant protein market is growing. It's 10 billion US as of last year, and you see in the dark blue in this graph, you know, it is increasing. So the rate of plant protein growth is increasing, but the same point is the rate of animal protein growth is also increasing, and the demand for animal protein is actually still quite a bit greater than the plant protein market. So even though I primarily talk about plant proteins, it's important to recognize that there's a significant market in the protein industry for animal-based proteins. And then we're seeing some rise in new proteins, microbe-based proteins, and insect proteins. And these are quite novel, especially these microbe-based proteins, because when we talk later about when we make these protein ingredients, the microbial protein is going to become a lot more important. Now, right now, the protein industry is really dominated by wheat and soya products. Now, pea and canola and others like faba beans, these are also really important, but they're very minor compared to the soya and wheat in the marketplace. So there's a tremendous amount of growth expected in those areas, especially because we want to remove or reduce the amount of soya protein in the marketplace because of soya allergens. So what's driving all this work on proteins? Well, there's really some big macro drivers You hear a lot about food security. How do we feed 11 billion people by 2050 to provide them an important, nutritious, sustainable protein source to support growth and development, especially in developing countries. There's some environmental concerns about using animal proteins and ethical issues about animal proteins. We see a lot of changes in dietary patterns caused by urbanization. So you see a lot of people moving towards urban centers. And with that, you see certain changing in dietary patterns. People are more open to the plant-based meals and things like that, that they have more variety in these urban centers. And demographics. So the millennial population is increasing quite a bit. And they have more buying power. They tend to stay at home. They don't leave the parents' house. They have more buying power, and they're more in tune to trying new, different diets, and that's driving a lot of the innovation. There's some health risk associated with cardiovascular disease, consuming animal-based products, driving towards plant-based alternatives, and nutrition. So there's a lot of government regulations that are coming in place. In Canada, we have what's called the Canada's Food Guide, and that basically provides dietary recommendations to the average consumer. Now, about 5 years ago, they changed this to reduce the amount of animal protein in response to plant-based alternatives, and this is really driving a lot of changes in people's dietary patterns based on these nutritional regulations. Now, very similar things are happening all over the world. So government regulators are trying to reduce the amount of animal consumption and then increase the amount of plant-based alternatives in the diet. So when we talk about animal protein or alternative proteins, obviously most of these are plant, and what I wanted to highlight here is the ones that are important to Saskatchewan and Canada. So we have oil seeds. Canola is really big here, but pulses, and this is what I want to talk about today, is pea and faba bean are really important. But we see a lot of activity in lentil and chickpea, and we grow a little bit of soya here in Canada. But pea and faba bean and lentils and chickpeas, the pulses are really important to Saskatchewan and Canada. And we've done a lot of work in that area. And then some cereal crops and cereal proteins are getting a lot of attention, especially with oat protein. It's kind of unique versus the other cereal-based proteins. And then some really unique proteins, insect protein, microalgae, microbial biomass. Now, each of these proteins have unique challenges. They have different protein profiles, processability, nutrition, functionality, and we can tie a lot of this stuff back to the seed and breeding programs. So it's really connected throughout the supply chain. So where does Canada fit in? Well, as you know, we're a major producer and exporter of a wide range of crops, particularly wheat, canola, peas, oats, and a number of other specialty crops. Now, what we're changing in Canada is a move from exporting commodities to value-added processing. So we're doing a lot of work and investment in building these infrastructure and plants to process, say, peas to make protein and fiber and starch ingredients for the food sector or pet food sector or other industrial applications. So a lot of activity and investment in that value-added processing. So this is just some market drivers. So the plant protein ingredient market is expected to contribute 4.5 billion to Canada's GPT. So we're really pushing this value-added processing, and there's large investments, and I'll show you in a minute what kind of investments that we're talking about. Another really interesting area is that little red box. So 40% of Canadians are incorporating more plant-based foods in their diet, and that's really important. So we are starting to see a decline in the plant-based food trends. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll see a decline in the ingredient and incorporating those into various food products. So we've built a really nice ecosystem here in Saskatchewan and the surrounding areas. Obviously, the University of Saskatchewan is sort of in the center, and it's really built on a lot of the great work that we're doing at the Crop Development Center. We have world-class breeders developing new varieties, disease resistance, yield, and we're starting to look at integrating quality attributes for the end market segments, especially as it relates to protein, is can we start tailoring cultivars for those end use markets? So we have the Crop Development Center, and we have a lot of that food value-added processing here in Saskatchewan. And then we align quite nicely with a lot of other protein strategies happening at neighboring universities and neighboring provinces. We have a number of federal facilities here, all aligning in terms of the protein strategy and moving forward as an ecosystem. And then once we do the work in the labs and the research, we can move into these innovation centers and we start producing products for the market, helping companies grow and integrating these into commercial production. There's a lot of investment happening in Saskatchewan, so we see dry and wet processing plants going up all across the prairie provinces, which is kind of in central Canada. A lot of work, and this is generating not only protein, but one of the big challenges for the protein industry is the starch. A huge amount of starch coming, especially off the pulses, and how can we find value-added uses of those starch molecules? So when we look at the market segments, one of the big area of interest is these texturized vegetable proteins. So you hear a lot about texturized soya protein. But we're doing a lot of work on texturized pulse proteins. So this is just an example of some texturized pea that we've done. But you can use pea, faba bean, lentil, all these different products to create new structures that have different functionality. So these particular texturized proteins actually can go in meat products. So maybe it's a meat hybrid or a vegan burger. And this is a really big market segments. And once you put these in the burger, they'll absorb water and oil and create that same texture as meat when you bite into this burger. So it's really innovative structuring of the proteins. Anyone try any vegan chicken? So this is really innovative. So we can take using an extrusion process, high moisture to create these fibrous ribbons. So we take our pea protein or mix it with pea and cereal proteins, and we create these fibers. And then through a lot of product development processes, we can create these chicken nuggets or chicken products that actually look like fibrous meat products. So we can align these proteins and structure them coming from our pulses to create these textures that people want. A lot of interest in plant-based seafoods. So can we make whole muscle fiber foods like a salmon fillet using pea protein? So there's a lot of work in technology to develop these plant-based products. On the right, that's a picture of a 3D printed steak. This is coming out of Israel, and it's really good. I had it at a trade show. It was barbecued, and it has that fibrous structure. And this is a soya wheat gluten type product. And then we can add various raspberry extracts to get the blood color. They're still working on the marbling lines that have the plant-based fats put in there, but it was really good. And you see that texture. So we can do this with a wide range of plant-based proteins. Non-dairy milks is really a big segment. If you go to the grocery stores, a huge amount of oat-based milks, you start seeing other ones like pea-based milks is another big one. And other ones like millet and other things that are popping up in the marketplace. And then can we take those milk products and make coffee creamers, yogurts, and vegan cheeses? So some of the challenges when we start trying to integrate proteins into the marketplace, so is flavor. This is probably the biggest challenge. Also, color would be roped in there as well. The pulses, as you know, have this beanie flavor, right? And how can we use processing or modifications to remove some of this flavor profiles to make it blander and more acceptable to consumers? Cost and supply is a big one, right? Pea is attractive and faba bean is attractive because it's half the price of lentils, right? So cost is important, and supply, right? If we have a big company looking to invest in switching out protein ingredients to replace soya, we have to ensure that we have sufficient supply of these ingredients to warrant these big government or big companies changing how they formulate products. Allergen is another concern. But there's a lot of advantages to alternative proteins, such as from pulses, right? Clean label, more environmental sustainability than some of the animal proteins, and they're really good functionality and have good nutrition. Now, functionality, when we talk about taking these ingredients and putting them in the foods, are they soluble to put in a beverage product? How do they foam, right? So, in a baked good application or salad dressing. So trying to understand and control how, the pea protein or the faba bean or other pulse proteins behave in products is really important to have that quality attribute out the other end. As you know, plant proteins are deficient in one or amino acids, and understanding the nutritional aspects, how can we make a complete protein by blending or through modification, is really important to the food industry. But, I take it, even though there's other non-food uses, my main target is the plant-based food markets. So sort of the overall goal of my program, I have a long tag there, but basically it's to find value-added uses of the plant proteins coming from our crops. And probably about 80% of my work is focused on the pulses because they're really important commercially here in Canada. And Canada is one of the largest producers and exporters of pulses. So we're in a really good area and space for this innovation to happen. So this is sort of my sort of theme areas in my research program. We work a lot with the Crop Development Center looking at feedstock quality, and I'll showcase some of the projects that we're working. You go right back to the field because there's a lot of innovations in the seed, whether it's talking about the protein profiles or quality attributes of the seed that allow us to process it better. These are all really important aspects when we talk about fractionation and end-use applications. So the big collaborative role in the breeding program. So I work at that end use of those seeds. And then we look at how can we take those seeds and process it to add value. So whether it's dry processing or wet fractionation to get different products out the other end, how can we improve functionality, nutrition, and flavor? How can we modify those ingredients further? And how can we use those in plant-based food applications? So, talking about, so I'm going to highlight sort of each of these areas and showcase some projects that we're working on. Now, in terms of improving the feedstock quality, I don't do the actual breeding itself, but we take the seeds and we have, through collaborations, we look at certain quality attributes. So how can we raise the total protein content in crops so we can fractionate more? The protein profile is really important, especially when we talk about nutrition and functionality. Depending on the ratios of proteins, that can have a direct impact on ingredient performance and protein quality. Nutritional, anti-nutritional compounds, understanding those and the impact of breeding programs, but also on processing to remove them, and looking at new assays that we can integrate into the breeding programs with that end-use application in mind. Trying to understand environmental effects, right? So it's not just one seed, it's in different regions, and how does that impact nutrition and functionality and processability? So that's sort of the area that we're working on in that value-added processing side. This is one example of a collaborative project led by Tom Workington, and the whole project is really aimed at developing a high protein line of pea. Now, for my area, or my interest is, how does the protein quality or functionality when we process high versus low peas into these products, what effect does that have on that end use application? And what some of our major findings are, the wet isolates that we produce from the high protein lines, we can really get that higher protein content, so we can sell that product for more versus a low protein line. So we can extract more protein, which makes sense. What was really interesting is that the low protein lines were actually had higher protein quality values, so they were more nutritious. So even though we're getting high protein, the different lines had different protein profiles, which had an potential end use different application. Functionality was very similar between the high and low protein lines, but the yield was negatively correlated. So the higher the protein content, the less yield of the crop was being formed. Now, the impact of this is that cultivar selection could be carried out by the end user. So if you're targeting nutrition, maybe you want to go for a low protein line to have higher protein quality values, which is measured by something called the PDCAS scores. Or maybe you want higher protein lines and you get more protein out of that final ingredient. Other opportunities stemming from the breeding programs I see in the future, the protein quality is obviously really important. The animal proteins are pretty much complete. They're around PDCAS scores of 1. Soybean is 82%, and some of the pulses are much lower. They range between, I guess, rail lentil 44, up to 77. Now, we can do a lot of work in the breeding programs to alter the protein profiles. For instance, select cultivars with more albumins, proteins which contain more sulfur amino acids. We can also use processing to help improve that digestibility at the other end, or fractionation to select one protein over the other. So we can get those protein quality scores up to make them more competitive against the animal proteins. Also developing higher protein cultivars with high yields, and looking at some of the anti-nutritional compounds. Some of these compounds affect color, flavor. The saponins give a bitter taste, digestibility, mineral absorption. So understanding the impact of those, especially as it relates to health, is really important. And then flavor. So can we knock out the genes for lipoxygenase or other flavor-enhancing compounds that are in the seed that can cause issues when we process them later on? And then how can we look at, so going from the field, how can we then take those seeds and find value-added uses? And you'll see a whole bunch of different products if you go to the grocery store or in the ingredient markets based all on protein, right? So you have milling. So we start off with the low value and looking at flours. And those flours have a lot of applications. And the functionality of the flours is really dependent on how we mill it and the particle sizes, and that really impacts functionality. How do we dehull to remove the seed coat? How does that impact color? So a lot of innovations in the milling side. A big common area is in dry processing is air classification. So and I'll compare this in a little bit, but that's a really nice process because it produces high protein content, but a lot less energy, no water, so it's cheaper than using a wet extraction process. And we see a lot of that across Canada in the dry processing area to get, say, you take pea, for instance, going from 23% protein to 50% protein in this process. There's a lot of innovations in that dry processing. There's a new technology called electrostatic separation that we're working on. And then the wet fractionation. So we see a lot of this and new technologies being implemented to help with that extraction process, whether it's microwave assisted, enzyme assisted, to free up those proteins and make them more extractable. And deflavoring is really important when we're making these ingredients. A lot of the dry and wet fractionation usually has a deflavoring step, because if the beanie flavor is too strong, it's really difficult to put in the products and the mass those flavor ingredients, because if the consumer doesn't like these products, they're not going to buy it. So flavor is really key for ingredient development. So when we talk about commercial protein ingredients, here's a list. And you start off with whole flours and you go right down to bioactive peptides. So depending on the level of processing, we can keep extracting more protein, more purity. And so we have a lot of opportunities, especially in the pulses and legumes, all throughout this chain. Now, as you go down, the process gets more and more expensive. The ingredients cost more, but they're higher value. So lower yield, higher value to reach different markets. And as I said, you have wet and dry fractionation facilities across Canada and around the world. The dry processing uses air classification, which is cheaper, no water, less purity, versus the wet extraction, a lot more energy involved. You have to use a wet process and then dry the water. You get more purity and different functionality, and they really hit two different markets in the food sector. This is just an example of a project that we looked at germination as a pre-treatment to air classification in both pea and faba bean proteins. So the idea is that when you germinate, there's enzymes that are released, and these enzymes we found actually help break up the protein starch interactions in the flour itself. So when we throw it in the air classifier, it goes up in the stream of air and it separates starches and proteins. And because that interaction is broken somewhat, we get better yield and better separation. So we were able to have more protein content, but also higher yields in that process. And we applied for a US provisional patent on this. So having those higher protein levels in, say, the pea and faba bean concentrates that are being produced are really advantageous, right? If we can get this above 65% protein, which is a little bit easier in faba bean, they can go directly into extrusion type activities to make extruded snacks or these meat analogs. So reaching those higher levels in a cheaper process will actually aid significantly in utilization of this protein ingredients. When we talk about fractionation, this is a typical wet fractionation process, and we don't have to go into the details, but basically you take your pulse flour, you put it in an alkaline medium and extract the proteins, clarify the solution, and then recover the proteins, whether it's through ultrafiltration or precipitation, and then dry that ingredient into your final pulse protein isolate. And you typically get over 80 or 90% protein in that final product. Now, what's really interesting about this process or flow diagram is that you can start going into various stages of this process and extract different proteins with protein profiles, or add flavor reduction strategies in this process to alter it to get different properties of your end ingredient. Now, there's different processes out there. Alkaline extraction is the most widely used in the industry, but there's other ones that you see. Salt extraction, which is more research-based, micellular extraction, which is more of a gentle process but high water usage. So through this, you can control different things like the albumin-globulin ratio, the viscin-legumin ratio, and flavors. This is just an example. I don't want to go into too much detail, but depending on how we extract the protein, you can get different total protein contents, different yields, and because of you're extracting different protein profiles, you get different functional attributes. So and this is important. So if you bought a protein isolate or concentrate from company A, that ingredient could behave completely different from company B and company C. So understanding how these ingredients are processed and the functional attributes is really important when you start integrating ingredients into products. We do a lot of work on deflavoring of pulse proteins. So we take these isolates, and this is done in collaboration with a couple organizations here in Saskatoon. And we looked at different approaches. So alcohol washing and absorbent resins. So these are ingredients we developed, pilot scale processing of these strategies or technologies, and we can create a really bland profile. So we can measure the flavor compounds and see them change over time, and understand what impacts those have on functionality. So sometimes, like alcohol washing, that can really remove the flavors really well, but it tends to have a negative effect on functionality. So it's finding that balance of functionality, nutrition versus flavor, right? But ultimately, if it doesn't taste good, consumers won't buy the products. We've recently done, spoiler, a lot of work on fermentation. Can we ferment these pulse proteins to, alter the functionality or nutrition? And one of the big impacts with fermentation we're seeing is in the flavor profile. So it's not reducing flavor, but it's altering the flavor profiles in these products. So we did one example that we worked at here at one of the food innovation centers using one fungi, Aspergillus oryzae, and we fermented it, and we had this umami flavor. And what we did was we integrated it into these chicken patties, and we were able to reduce the salt flavor, the salt content quite considerably. And this flavor enhances with this fermented pulse ingredient. Now, this is important because when we talk about plant-based foods, we basically highlight the fact that it's not animal-based, reduced cardiovascular disease. But if you notice on the labels, the salt content in these plant-based foods can be quite high. So looking at that salt reduction strategy is really important for going forward. And then we have all these ingredients that reduce wet and dry fractionation, and how can we modify them? So, when we look at, say, soya, for instance, there may be 30 or 50 different ingredients, and they're kind of tailored to different applications. One's good in baking, one's good in beverages, and so on. Now, when we talk about pulses, we're not really there yet, right? And if we look at different strategies to modify these ingredients, we can look at tailoring these for certain product applications, to maybe make them perform better as in a beverage, or how can we change it applications for flavor, or a sports bar, or a non-dairy milk? How can we modify functionality through processing, right? So we've looked at a number of different strategies: pH shifting, blending of proteins. Blending is really neat because we can make a complete protein. So if we combine cereal proteins and pulses, or pulses and oilseed proteins, we can get unique ingredients that are healthier for the consumer, especially those on vegetarian-based restricted diets. We've used other things like enzymes, fermentation, infrared heating, all focus on ingredient modification. This is just an example of how we can use the technology to modify the functionality of ingredients. So we use a pH shifting and approach. So basically, we take our protein ingredient and we raise it up to an extreme pH and cause the proteins to unravel, or maybe we'll go to low pH. And once it unravels, it exposes different amino acids, and you get different surface properties. And this surface properties is then tied to the functional attributes. So we treat it there, maybe we add heat, maybe we don't, and then we reduce it back to neutral and spray dry it and get a new novel ingredient that structurally is different from what we started with. And you can see in this graph, looking at P solubility. So the black is the untreated. And when we do this treatment, we can do a threefold increase in solubility. And so these treated proteins would make an excellent beverage or milk application. So this is just another example of a new toy that we have in the lab. So we can look at the foaming properties. So we modify these these proteins, and how well do they stabilize in a foam, right? So when we make a foam, proteins align at the gas interface and create that bubble structure, which we see on the right. And so here we can look at the microstructure of these bubbles. We can look at how it breaks down, and understand how proteins work as a foaming agent, or we've also done work at an emulsifying agent, right? So these are important for beverage applications. We have a big project looking at pea-based protein foams or emulsions in coffee applications. So it's really interesting. and the opportunities that we see in these ingredients. So the idea is that we take these informations or ingredients and we start tying them to applications. So depending on what application we're looking at, we may target one attribute or the other to make these really neat products. And here we have an example of a whipped topping, right? A plant-based whipped cream or a baking application. And even though, if we talk about these cakes or bread products, even though we may not be able to replace all the wheat gluten to have the same quality, integration or fortifying it with some of these plant-based proteins from pulses can really improve the nutritional value of these baked goods. So there's a big industry interest in that. And then how can we then use it to create value-added applications? And in our lab, we don't really do product development because our products tend not to taste good, but we do a lot of the innovations in the protein ingredients to solve some of the product development issues that people are facing in the industry. So we've done work on plant-based 3D printed meat. We've made vegan scrambled eggs, edible packaging, non-dairy creamers, meat analogs, milks, fermented meals, tempeh. So a lot of applications that we're looking at in industrial or commercial applications that our companies are coming for help in using these ingredients. So this is just an example of making vegan scrambled eggs. And this is a really neat application. A lot of the plant-based proteins, they use it as a milk or not milk in baking applications, right? Integrating these as an egg replacer. But we want to look at scrambled eggs. So can we make a protein and design it so that when you heat it on a skillet, it gels, right? Just like scrambled eggs, and you create this texture, right? And so we've done a lot of work on looking at how can we make, these are emulsion-based ones, which means they're proteins, water, and oil. So we develop these eggs, and we have the same protein content as eggs, the same lipid content as eggs. We blend it a certain way to create these different emulsions, make them stable, because on the shelf there'll be this emulsion-based product, and then we pour it out into your skillet, cook it up, and have the same texture as eggs. So right now we've have the same flavor profile and the same texture as egg. Now we're trying to solve a color issue that we're facing using these plant-based proteins, especially because they have more of a brownish greenish tinge versus a yellow. So we have a lot of innovations to do in color development of these plant-based ingredients. This is another example of how we use extrusion of pulse-based vegetable proteins. In this particular example, I think I'm using lentil, but we've done pea and faba bean. And so we use what's called an extruder to make these extruded ingredients. So you see there on the right of that three-picture thing, and these basically bind water and oil. So when you put them into products, they basically, whether it's a vegan burger or a hybrid, these ingredients mimic the taste of the texture of real beef, and then with flavor profiles, you can change that to hit different markets. So this is an example of C is our lentil burger, vegan burger that's made of the lentil-based TVP, and it has the same texture as the real meat. You notice that if you look at the size, it's also able to retain its shape. So when you put it on the barbecue, it doesn't shrink like other products. This is another example of a 3D printed meat. Now, obviously, it doesn't look like meat, but this is made of pea protein. And one of the things that we wanted to do is we did an application to showcase the technology to long-term care homes. So when you get old, there's a large population or subset of the population that has dysphagia or difficulty swallowing. So when they feed people in the long-term care homes, the meals are basically pureed foods. So they appear on the plate as basically a puddle or a mush of food. Almost looks like baby food, and it's not very dignitary for elderly. So if we can use 3D printing, we can take structured foods but still have a mousse-like texture, so they'll be able to consume it without difficulty swallowing. We can also add personalized nutrition, so we can add vitamins and minerals to actually tailor a food product and nutrition for a certain patient. So this is just an example of how we just use this small 3D printer for that application. And this is a meat, pea protein based formulation, flavored, tastes like real beef. If you remember earlier in the thing, I showed you a 3D printed steak, so you can use that technology to get this fiber-like texture as well, but we just don't have that capability here at Saskatchewan. We also do a lot of work on training. So one of the big problems with the protein industry is finding highly qualified people. So we have this really large grant, really focused on training people in the plant protein space. And one of the ideas is that this program really teaches protein science coming from our crops, but also provides them leadership and business skills. So when they go into the market, they'll be able to hit the ground running and understand how the protein ingredients, the connection between the seed and the breeding programs to the end use markets, understand what plant-based drivers are in the marketplace, understand leadership and business skills, to create these specialized graduates that will enter the protein sector. And there's a huge economic growth happening in that sector in Canada, in part because of all the investments in infrastructure. This program trains 54 graduate students across 3 provinces in Canada, all on the plant protein ingredient sector. I'd like to acknowledge a number of past and current funders. We also receive a lot of industry funders, especially from the ingredient side and the product application side. But one of the main ones, I like to acknowledge is the government of Saskatchewan, which really invests significantly in agriculture and value-added processing of our ingredients. So that concludes my slideshow. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Michael. It was a very interesting and very dense presentation. We touched many topics on this on the whole processing chain. Let's see if there's questions from our friends here connected. Okay, so I see a few raised hands. Marcus.
Yeah, Michael, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. I enjoyed very much. I would like to get your opinion on the development of breeding of for specific purposes in the food industry. So say, how do you see the potential for a pea variety that is particularly suited for processing in a dairy alternative, in a pea milk? Is that a direction you take in Canada? Is the link clear between breeding and food processing, or do we have too many actors in between so that it's not possible to develop this link?
We have you're right. We have a lot of area in supply chain. We have a lot of influencers. So and there's not a direct link. So the processing sector or fractionation sector is really important to control that functionality, because if we heat treat the proteins, doesn't matter what kind of quality is coming off the seed, if we process it wrong, we denature it, it doesn't perform well. So that processing sector is really essential to control the functionality of those ingredients to target, say, a milk application or meat application. So that's controlling the functionality. Now, from the breeding side, going into these fractionation facilities, there's some big issues that could help. So, for instance, improving the protein quality. So, adjusting the protein profile to raise the sulfur amino acid content, right? So, can we select or screen varieties that have higher levels of those particular amino acids, and then the end result is that when we process into ingredients, they have higher what's called PD-Cas scores. So when you get into the food sector, you can start making protein claims on products. Flavor is another big one. So, you know, we can deflavor things in the processing, but it's not 100% effective. If you can say knock out lipoxygenase, and then, you know, that enzyme, for instance, causes oxidation to increase, which then causes flavor issues in the end product. Raising the protein content in, say, pea is important because we can fractionate more protein out the other end and make more money, right? So as long as the yield is up, those are important. We've done a lot of work on different genotypes and environment of peas, and we don't see huge differences in functionality. We see minor fluctuations, but nothing that you would say we need to sole source this cultivar over the other. So functionality, you know, depending on the variety, it's very similar, but we do see differences in the nutritional aspects, the protein quality of those seeds.
Thanks.
Okay, we received a question for the chat, but I guess it's more or less you already answered, because it was again about breeding and what are the most important properties in breeding. There's other raised hands. Yes, Carlotta.
Okay. Hi, Michael. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I have a question, because especially for you, because you work on this type of area of research. Don't you think that the market is now becoming more aware of the costs or the sustainability of the processing choices? So if you for instance, imagine you are talking about air fractionation, and you said it is much more environmental friendly because you don't have so much electricity, or you don't need the water. So do you think that the market will oblige the industry to change the way they see processing?
So, you know, the food market is pretty complex because you have different consumers, right, and different products. So some consumers, but everything is cost. So some people can afford the really high, the meat analogs, and they want those isolates. So there's always going to be a market. But I think, you know, the price of food is so expensive and it keeps on going up. Even plant-based foods are similar or sometimes more than animal-based products. So I think you'll see a lot more dry processing because those ingredients are cheaper, and then the food company can make them cheaper. And I think, you know, there's been for the last, you know, decade, there's been a big push for plant-based foods, and that trend is starting to decline a little bit. But what's unclear to me is that, you know, the advertising plant-based foods may be in decline, but that doesn't necessarily mean the ingredients will be in decline, right? So as long as those ingredients are cheaper and they perform well, then a food company will integrate those ingredients because they want to sell more product to make more profit. So I think we see a decline in plant-based foods, but I think the lower cost ingredients will be important. I think we'll also see more of a rise also in, you know, even less processed, so the flours or the whole pulses, and looking at innovations that we can do that, because a lot of people can't afford, you know, foods, right? And getting these cheaper and convincing the public, okay, you know, and in Canada, you know, pulses are, I wouldn't say they're well received. You know, people aren't aware of them, right? In Saskatchewan, they are, but educating the public of the benefits of eating pulses, how do you even cook them, all that stuff is really important. I think you'll see a lot more of that because people can't afford, you know, the mainstream food, right?
Thank you. There's Dr. Salman Ahmad, please.
I am Dr. Salman. I have one question for you. You have talked about the trainings of the young scientists. Either those trainings are only for the Canadian people or the foreigners can also apply for that?
So how that, basically what happens is we have 3 universities and we have a number of researchers at those universities as part of this program. We take on grad students and part of projects that we have ongoing. Those grad students come from all over the world, right? So we recruit just like any graduate program. We take it from we take it from, you know, we have a lot of people from India, we have Africa, Latin America, Brazil, a lot less Canadians for some reason. Almost 80% is international students here.
Okay, but there is no cushion or space for the like me myself is a faculty member. There is no provision for the scientists or the faculty or the accommodations.
No, because these are only for students. But say we had a project that me and you were working on together, then that student, as long as he's registered in the University of Saskatchewan and co-supervised, then there could be an interaction.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Oh, Tom wants me to tell about my pea oat blend story.
Yes.
We've done a lot of work on food security, and a number of years ago we had a big food security project making food aid, and we looked at pulses and cereals and blending them in a certain way to make food aid products for Ethiopia. And you know, from that, some of the research that we did there about nutritional profiles, it wasn't pea, Tom, it was lentil oat we blended. So we made basically, we went to the food center here in town and we blended oats and lentils and oats at a certain ratio to maximize that nutrition and made a soup mix. And so we developed this mix and we partnered with the Saskatchewan food banks. So we developed 15,000 units of these soup mixes, and they are currently being distributed across the province before Christmas. And each unit can feed a family of 4 or 5. So we're really excited to get the oats and lentil product out there in market and as a test launch, and then the food bank wants to roll this out across the country. So we're partnering with a lot of ingredient producers to donate grains to create these products for the for, you know, families in need. And you know, each soup mix is about 80 cents to produce, which is really good to feed a family of 5. So.
Okay, so I don't see other questions. I have, oh no, wait, somebody's writing in the chat. Okay. Yeah. I have a specific question. You said that at some point you said that you are using also Aspergillus oryzae for at least starting a fermentation and changing the properties of the proteins. And if you could elaborate a little bit. So as an example, why that specific fungus, and have you tried other species, or how it happens?
Yeah, so yeah, we tried Aspergillus oryzae. Aspergillus niger as a fungi strain, and we've tried Lactobacillus plantarum bacteria strain to modify these protein ingredients. Now we chose those for because they have GRAS status, so we can use those in food. We don't have any issues in terms of we can grow them in sort of, you know, not level 2 micro labs, so we can handle those a lot easier in the food space in our lab. So that's why we chose those ones, in part because they have GRAS status, so we're able to use those with ease in the food industry.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, are there any other questions?
I have a question also referred to fermentation, because I know Oride and Niger are used for mostly for savory application. Let's think about the soy sauce, for example, is produced with the Aspergillus. Do you have any recommendation for called microbes that they may serve for more sweet applications, so it make it more sweet than salty?
No, in part because I'm not a microbiologist. They take too long to get results. But yeah, I'm not a microbiologist, so I can't. Now we're also looking at, there's a Saccharomyces one that we're looking at. So depending on the fungi you choose, you can get obviously different flavor profiles and things like that. And you're right, the Aspergillus does use for soya, and that's why we saw the Unami flavor in the pulse ingredients. So when we put them into the burger application, we're just starting the fermentation area of these, so I don't really have a good answer, but I know that the fermentation piece to control that flavor has a lot of opportunity in that space. I just don't know the bugs well enough to answer that.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Okay, I see that our time is over, and once again, I want to thank Michael for this very interesting contribution. I thank everybody that was present here for this new webinar. We'll have a new webinar next year because now it's December, but you can already find everything on our website. There is already the full calendar for, in fact, I'm opening the website right now, and the next one will be on January 9 with Marianne Proudhon on peer resilience to drought. So thanks again, Michael, for this contribution, and thank to everybody that was present here, and see you all. And as always, this is going to be on our website and on our YouTube channel.
Thanks, everyone.